Do you want to start with the discussion about proposals, like what it's like to put one together? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, no, I think that'd be really interesting. So maybe on my side, right? Like I always tell people because people are like, "Oh, you need to have the brand send out a number first." And I'm like, "Look, he or she who has the money has the leverage." And I'm like, "So best case scenario, most of the time it's you would aim for 50-50. Very few times in my career have I had a case where I have more leverage than the brand, but I always say the brand starts out 51-49. They because they got the money.
Yeah.
Um, and so, look, it's my job, right? I say as an agent, and I have a very small select group. I've got 4 triathletes and 2 World Cup mountain bikers. So it's my job to understand and know that market very closely, very intimately, and put out a number that ultimately gets the job done, right? And it can't be something that causes inflammation for you. It has to be something that both parties look at and go, yeah, that makes sense, right? Like that's a good deal. Um, and so, look, I have some, I would say, some nuance to what I do and where I think I can push the boundaries. And typically in this world of sports marketing, you've got a base salary component, you've got a bonus schedule component, and I like to pick out probably what are the 1 or 2 races that I know are really, really important to the athlete and the brand. And typically in my world, that's the Olympics and World Championships.
Mhm.
So, again, I'm not giving away my playbook here, but I will do a what I would call a very aspirational number for the bonus of the Olympics and the World Championships. And what I like to do with that is I signal that winning is the most important piece for us, with the athlete that I'm representing. And so that signals to the brand that, hey, this athlete is serious about winning, because when we'll make up some numbers here, but it's I might say it's $250,000 to win world championships in our Olympic games. And people would say, "Oh, I want you to do a 250 for first, 200 for second, and 175 for third." And I'm like, it ain't working like that. We're gonna do 250 for first, we're gonna do 30 for second and third, because the reality is a second or third, at a brand.
Yeah.
You've worked at the biggest sports marketing brand in the world. Uh, Second and third is not the same as first, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
and you don't. That's no disrespect to the athletes that have gotten a silver or bronze medal at those key games, um, but there is a really clear distinction, right? And
Yeah,
and
absolutely. World
this,
champion, Olympic champion. Yeah, absolutely is a much different position than
yeah,
being on the podium.
uh,
I think one of the things too that's important in that part of the discussion as you're getting ready to propose a number is also kind of demonstrating the value of the athlete and helping the person on the inside understand, right? Because you're trying to set them up for success as well. Like you're trying to
sure,
make that athlete manager look good or that sports marketing person that you're talking to. And you have to kind of help them craft the internal story
yeah,
if they're going to go and get extra money
yeah,
for that athlete. And if you can do a good job of saying, like, hey, Lionel's going to try to win Kona, but also he's going to drive 2 million views a month on his channel and really engage with like thousands and thousands of people every single week in and week out. That gives that person a better leg to stand on when it comes time to internally pitch that athlete to fight for more dollars or to pick out like, maybe as I'm building their contract, I could think about the incentive structure, but also I think I could get some project funding to put more resources behind their YouTube channel, to put more resources into this project or into this element of the thing. And so the way I think about athlete sponsorship specifically is about surface area. So it's
yep,
not just only, how are they going to compete and what are they going to do there? Because that's a great way to get visibility if they're smashing it. But I also think about sort of protecting the other side of it of like, where else can they bring value to the brand and what else can they do? But also, what else can the brand do with them to sort of activate on that partnership that's not reliant on a good race or a bad race?
yeah. No, and you mentioned Lionel Sanders, who's, I'm fortunate that he's been one of my athletes that I've gotten to work for over 5 years now. Um, he obviously can do two things at once, right? He won 3 races this year. He's a content monster.
Mm.
He did over 2 million views with his in less than 1 month with his Kona vlog series. And so when you can probably help create a picture for the brand and say, look, like these are the solutions that this athlete will provide. And I think that that's one thing that people always get a little bit wrong with me, right? People think of me as a salesman. And yes, at the end of the day, my job is to sell my athletes. But I always tell people, look, I'm not in the sales business. I'm in the solutions business.
Mm.
My athletes provide a solution for your brand. And in the case of Lionel, he's a 2-for-1, which is massive because he can create visibility, and two, he can win races, right? It's so that for most brands is something that, is really challenging to find. Especially, I'm sure we're going to talk about influencers and whatnot and on this, but in this current era, that's something that, brands are really looking for. But like you said, it's providing, a picture or a map or the ability to forecast with an athlete marketing manager and say, look, these are the solutions I believe this athlete will provide for you. And frequently when it's, as we're communicating, I'll say, like, do you have all of the ammunition that you need to fight for my athlete? Because that marketing manager has got to go present their case to a team typically and say, this is why I believe we should have this athlete on board. So, yeah, I think, again, I say in sports marketing, there are no rules. It's like, this is a little bit of a make-believe world in how we want to establish and create value. Yes, there's some guidelines, right? But it's, I say it all the time. I'm like, look, I didn't go to school for this. There's no playbook. There's nobody taught me this. This is a learned career that I've come into from on the job training.
I love that idea that there are no rules. I absolutely live by that one as well. And I think, Lionel's just such a perfect example of, like, yeah, he can give the breakout performances athletically, but he can also connect with an audience on a week in and week out basis that is sort of like a guaranteed thing. Whether or not he has a great, world champs or whatever is sort of like anybody's guess, right? Probably decent chance based on his previous performances. He's going to perform well in a competitive environment. But regardless, you've essentially protected the downside by saying, like, well, we know that he can stay consistent with this content output, that he's engaging with the fans, that he's giving them a lot of resources, and we can use that to bring additional value to the brand. So it is sort of like this 1-2 punch where he's going to be good competitively, but he also can deliver. I'd love to hear more actually about Lionel. I'm super curious. Just what does that look like? And we could go athlete by athlete. You're also managing Taylor, who just had the most insane season as well. But I'd be curious to know, like, how does it work when you do have, Lionel as the production company and output and Lionel as the athlete? How do you think about that when you're speaking to brands or how you're managing that?
Sure. Yeah, I think what I always like to try and communicate to my athletes and to brands ultimately is what the North Star is for that athlete for the given year or period, right? And so ultimately, like, Lionel's goal is, I want to win Ironman World Championships. Okay, how are we going to get there? We're going to tell my story on YouTube. I'm going to document. I'm going to talk about the ups, the downs, the races that I've won along the way, and I'm going to bring you in, and I'm going to find and create a ton of emotion and attachment to my audience. And what I think what Lionel has effectively become is an online motivational speaker.
Yeah.
And you go there, you watch a 12 or 15-minute episode, and then you want to go out and chase whatever you're doing, whether that's triathlon, ultra marathon. I get a ton of cyclists that watch all of his content, and so I think that's what he does a very great job on. So I'm not sure that I answered. I forgot what your question was, but I think
I'm just really curious too about how does an athlete emulate that? Like, Lionel now has momentum, right? Like, more
yeah,
people are going to watch his stuff, and he's going to be able to keep making videos on YouTube until the end of time if he
yep,
wants. And
yep,
that will always be profitable. He will always have a connection to a large community, a large audience. Even after he's done competing, he still is going to have stories to tell for eternity. And I think that the hardest part a lot of athletes are trying to figure out is like, well, how do I do that? Where do I even begin? And
Yeah.
what does it look like? I've got to assume that there's people helping Lionel put this together. But, for your other athletes or for athletes that aren't working with you directly, how do they think about this or how should they think about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I always tell people, and again, I get a lot of, I would say I've got some younger athletes and I get a lot of questions from younger athletes. And I always have to stop and remind them. I'd say Lionel won over 20 races before he started a YouTube channel. So his core business was winning and performance. And then he realized he needed to build a bridge from that, right, to something else. And so I get these questions from athletes all the time. I want to start a YouTube channel. I want to do this. And I'd say, look, let me give you some insight into the time, energy, and finances that it takes to specifically do a YouTube channel.
Mhm.
And normally that's enough to scare most people away. They go, oh, no, 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 I don't want to do that anymore. No, okay, I'm over that. But I think it provides some context and some framing for the investment that somebody like a Lionel Sanders or even my wife has done to, say, look, I'm gonna build this media presence on a digital platform, and I'm going to, I'm going to invest in myself here, right?
Mm.
And I think that's probably the biggest thing. So it's understanding that it takes a lot of time. It's a monster that's got to be fed every week, and are you willing to invest in it, right? And I think that's that's what I get the journey to get most athletes on, to just get them to see it from somebody who's actually been a part of it, right? And then they
Yeah.
can make their own decisions like, do I want to keep going there or not?
It's interesting to think about the fact that he already had sort of the momentum, which probably made it easier for him to start. Because I think for a lot of people starting channels, the hardest part is getting to that first 1,000 subscribers, monetizing it, getting people to consistently watch all of that stuff. And obviously, if you are a legendary triathlete and then you turn on the YouTube thing, you've got that momentum already. And I think that's it. Like you're getting visibility elsewhere and then you're drawing it into this channel where people can
Yep.
go even deeper with you. Because yeah, if you don't have any of that and you're starting from zero in every possible way, it's going to be a lot harder. And you have to come from the angle that I came from, where I love making videos. I'm just an editor at heart,
Yep.
and I just wanted to make bike videos again. I missed carrying around the backpack. I missed editing, documenting, sharing with my friends.
Yep.
And that's where my channel started from. And then it picked up momentum. And now I've got sponsors, and now I'm doing more projects and traveling around and doing stuff. But I had to start from zero and I had to gut it out for a
For
couple
a long
years
time.
to
Yep.
get to the point where they start giving you these little silver buttons. So
Totally.
it's a much different way. There's really kind of two ways in. First, build up your athletic career to the point where people care about you and then turn it on, or start from zero, but know that it's going to be an absolute grind. I think, Eric Lagerstrom, one of our mutual friends as
Yep.
well, had that same thing that I had, where he loved making videos no matter what. And his competitive stuff was feeding into it. So he's kind of more of like a 50-50, but he needed to put out videos in the way that I needed to put out videos. And
Yep.
so there's really kind of two different camps of creators that are out there. And I don't think one is right or wrong.
Correct. Yep. Yep. I agree.
So do you think, I mean, now you've got Taylor, she's absolutely on top of the world in triathlon. What's the conversation look like with her? I mean, she could afford, probably get partners to help her build out her YouTube channel. She's at,
Sure.
I think, 4,000 subscribers right now from a little test a year or two ago. Is that a discussion that you'd be having of, I mean, is that some kind of advice that you would give someone that is at that point in their career? How does that come about?
Yeah. So yeah, no, thanks for recognizing the success that Taylor Knibb has had, on the, like what I call on the field of play this year. So yeah, she was a dual world champion this year, at T100 world champion, which is a new series that's come out in the sport of triathlon, and then the Ironman 70.3 world champion. And I'll just throw on there, she was a dual Olympian, so the only one at the games. So she competed in the time trial and she competed in the triathlon. So,
So cool.
look, I'll use Taylor as an example. She certainly has I would call it like the street cred, or the results to piggyback and start a YouTube channel. However, I go back to where I talked about that North Star and where does that fit into performance. And so yes, that's something that she will ask me about and say, hey, look, should I invest a little more time in my YouTube? And I'd just always say, do you want to? Like I'd say, look, if you want to, sure, that's something I can help sell. I go, but does that add value to your life ultimately, right? Is that
Mm.
something that you want to do? Is it something that's important to you? When you start talking to, we'll use Lionel as an example. When you talk about his content and his plans, he just can't stop talking about it. It's something that he's passionate about. And so it has to come from an intrinsic value to say, look, no, I have something I want to say, I have something I want to express, and I'd like to put it on this platform. And so, yeah, it's the same conversation. Certainly, could Taylor be, I'd call it like dominating on YouTube right now? Absolutely. But is
Mm.
that something that motivates her or inspires her every single day?
Yeah.
I'm probably gonna say no right now, but she'll do some YouTube videos this year. I mean, she's gonna do some.
Yeah.
It's just not a forward facing, I guess, plan for her.
Yeah. Time's got to be right. Well, Taylor just won. I mean, we're recording this like within days of her winning the world championships in New Zealand, right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, you're her agent. She just won her second world championship of the year. You've got time to talk to me on a podcast, but like, what is your life like right now when an athlete has a big result? Like, is the iron hot and you got to strike, or it's December, so like job's done already? Like,
Yeah, I
what's
would say,
this? What's it
yeah.
like?
So, one, I think it's important. I want to recognize that obviously Taylor Knibb did win the 70.3 World Championships. Also want to recognize I got second place there as well with my client, Kat Matthews. And then
One, two.
Kat won the inaugural Ironman Pro Series. So it was, yeah, really, really, I would say, special weekend for me to be a part of, with those two athletes. And the short answer is yes, I am busy. Yes, it is December. So so what happened is normally these 70.3 World Championships are in, like, last year they were in August, but now this year they were awarded in Taupo, New Zealand. So they had to wait for December to come around because that's basically the peak of their summer. So in a normal year, you know, typically for most brands, they're doing a lot of scheduling and forecasting for their deals. Like, stuff's getting done. You'd start talking in the spring, and then stuff would start getting placed July, August, September, October. Still, you'd get some stuff done maybe in November, but like December 16th, I mean, we're getting pretty long in the tooth here. Like, stuff's kind of done. So, look, those two athletes really have a ton of flexibility, and they have a ton of leverage, and that they get to, given how great they are, we get to be very selective and very picky about who our partners are. So if you look at their portfolio of who they have, it's best in class across the board.
Mhm.
And their results this weekend allow me to keep doing my job for them the best that I can. So yeah, I'm really blessed. But yeah, it's weird. The one thing that's going on in the industry, and I don't know if this is specific to cycling, but it's also, I'm seeing it in some other stuff too, is everything was just shifted late this year.
Mm.
So there was a lot of stuff that got done, and it's still, and frankly, like, I'm still working on, I mean, I had calls, I have calls this entire day, because stuff is just going later than normal. And so I don't know why that is. But that is one thing that I noticed this year, even when we were starting really early in the year with some preseason stuff.
I was saying on a newsletter recently that I feel like silly season didn't happen. And normally like September, October, you just get bombarded with like so and so is signed with this team, so and so is on this team, so and so's off that team. And it hadn't happened. I hadn't seen or heard anything. And then like last week, all the teams started, shuffling. And unfortunately, like a lot of people are off teams, not on teams,
Yeah.
which seems sort of like a downstream impact from, everything that has happened in the last couple of years in the cycling industry. But what's that been like on your side? Does that sort of track with what you've seen?
Um, the short answer is yes. Look, I'm really blessed that I only have six athletes on my roster. They're all very, very talented at what they do. And so look, I don't think somebody would mind me sharing this story. I had a major bike brand call me last January, and they said, look, we have over 90 athletes on our roster. We've identified 4 that we must have in 25 and beyond, and 2 of them are yours. um, and so, look, that's an honor and a privilege. And again, we go back to the leverage conversation that we had at the beginning. It was 51-49 advantage me, when they say that. But look, the reality is that they needed to get something. They needed to get something done. And so I saw a lot of brands. I would say probably cutting out and eliminating what I'll call like tier 2 or tier 3 athletes. And by no offense, that can be the actual level that they're at, or that can be the dollar spend that they're at. Like, but what happens is these big bike brands are given a pot of money that they say you've got to cover enduro, mountain bike, downhill, triathlon, road cycling is its own thing, gravel, and we have a 30% cut this year. We don't care where you find the 30%, but you need to find the 30%. And so that may be done. They can get rid of one big athlete, and all of a sudden they go, okay, I only got 10% to go. Or they can do it, okay, I got to do it piece by piece by piece. And again, it's, Aaron, you worked in sports marketing. It's timing of, okay, well, who do I actually have available that comes off a contract that I can even get rid of?
Yep.
Like that's a thing too. Like, hey, I'm held up on the monetary side because these people don't come off till 26 or whatever the year is. And I think a lot of what happened in 25 or in the end of 24 was from contracts that were signed in peak COVID of 21, 22. So
Yep.
where companies would have loved to have jettisoned those contracts at the end of 23, they were still bound by them through the end of 24.
Yeah, the timing element of contracts, that's I think the one thing that most people outside of sponsorship do not understand. How come they let him go? How come this? It's like, no, they had a window where they had to make this call, and it was either this, stick around for another 2 years, or there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I always try to explain to athletes, right? And because people will, um, people will try to understand what my role is, and I'll say, look, like the brands a lot of times like dealing with a competent agent because it's much easier to have that conversation, the tough conversation with the agent versus the athlete that they formed a bond with, right?
Yep.
And so you need a little bit of that buffer when it comes either renewal time or see you later time. And so people will say, I'm like, look, athlete managers love dealing with agents when they got to give them bad news. And I think that's the reality. And the other thing that athletes have a hard time, would say, processing, that I've got to a lot of times be a buffer for, is at the end of the day, these athletes are numbers on an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm not trying to minimize that these are people that have lives, that have got responsibility. But at the end of the day, when a brand puts down a budget, it's got to fit on the Excel spreadsheet, right? And it's got to make sense. And I think that's the really hard part. That it's tough. It's tough on the brand side too, but that's the reality.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to have that conversation with an agent and be just honest and open with them without ruining the vibe with the athlete. Because
Totally.
as you know, business planning for most companies is happening over the summer.
Yep.
And the answer probably by like August, if they're going to stick around for the following season or not. You can start having those conversations. But what you wouldn't want to do is go up to an athlete before they compete in world championships and tell them like, hey, by the way, it's probably a wrap after this, unless,
or pressure's on. Yeah. You got to perform here. It's now or never type of thing, you know? And I think so. That's, I mean, and even in this, the shuffling that happens with all the teams, right? It's my job. I always tell people, I said, it's my job to get a yes or a no. And I go, I've had, I just say it. I worked for a women's world tour cycling team. I went to every single bike brand that exists to ask them if they sponsor that team. And when it came down to it, the last time I did a bike deal, there were two names. There were two bike brands that would do the deal, and I'd get hounded. Well, what about Pinarello? What about such? I'd say I talked to him. I got to know. And so what I have to do is not onboard the frustration of the no's that would really dent the confidence of my client.
Mm-hmm.
But it's my duty to ensure that I get every answer possible to give them the best framework possible. And this is, again, I get athletes that come up to me all the time that will say, hey, I'm supposed to renew with this brand. I asked for a raise and they wouldn't give it to me. And I'll say, oh, cool. What was your other offer? And they go, oh, no, I didn't have one. And I go, I go, so you had a wish. I go, oh, that's cool. I said, so you wished you could get a raise. I go, look, like, you have to demonstrate fair market value and you have to demonstrate why you should get a raise. And I go, I said, they might want to keep you. And there might be some, I've had it in the case where we can do an early renewal because an athlete's got a ton of momentum and the brand says, like, I don't want this agent to go out and shop this deal because I think that it could get more expensive for me. But that's front end risk that we're all taking. The brand is really taken together, but I think it has to make sense.
Yeah.
But you always have to go looking for the answers. But yeah, that happens to me all the time where people, I wish they could give me a raise, and be like, what's your other offer?
Well, you talked about the world tour team, and you and I, before we started recording, we're talking about the UCI World Championships. What seems to be happening right now is that not only is it, the sponsorship fees for the athletes, but also for the races themselves. The UCI has boosted up the amount of money it costs to race in the series. World Tour has gone up. Can you talk a little bit more, or even share a couple of stories? But
Sure.
What's that like? Because now the money is being separated even further away from the athletes, and it costs more money to race now, just
Yep.
for even to put your athlete into a race.
Yeah, so I'll try to give as much context in the most concise manner possible. I might riff for a little bit here. What you have going on in UCI, I'll call it the mountain bike side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think of that as the UCI really effectively owns that product. Now, it's different in the case because now Warner Brothers owns, we'll call it the race course and the broadcast, where before it was a bifurcation of Red Bull owned the broadcast and the UCI owned the field of play. And so there was, I would say, a misaligned incentive. If the broadcast got better, it wasn't because they wanted to sell more on course. It was really two entities that weren't, I would say, speaking to each other in the same way. Where now you have Warner Brothers that I'll say owns the field of play and owns the broadcast. So the better the broadcast, the more sponsorship deals that they can sell on the field of play. Now, some nuance to that is Warner Brothers is also effectively running the event for the UCI. So in this case, this year they've doubled the registration fee for the mountain bike teams and haven't really made it clear what the mountain bike teams get in return. They've also, they're planning to add more events. The events, each mountain bike race costs money that you have to do. So I think the part that excites me is that there is an alignment on the broadcast and the courses. And I think that in the long run, that will create more sponsorship opportunities for, I will just say, non-endemic brands to come in and give them a reason to sponsor either the downhill or the cross country. Aaron, given your experience at Red Bull, did I probably describe that situation clearly to the lay person?
That's interesting that you talked about sort of the misalignment. I think, yeah, Red Bull was making they did a great job, in my opinion, with the live stream, but they were doing it just as sort of an investment in the sport
as their own project. They
Yeah.
weren't trying to make money on the back end of it, right? They weren't trying to say, "Hey, Tag Heuer, we've got this amazing product. We think you should pay us $2.5 million to sponsor the series," right?
And I think everyone in mountain biking wants it to go back to 1990s mountain biking because that's when everybody, car brands and watch brands and all these companies were coming and just throwing money at mountain bikers. That was the age of the $1 million mountain biker. And that got a lot of people into the sport for probably that reason. And then everybody kind of went away. And, I'd say broadcast has actually gotten better since the 90s, clearly. But then what? Like, how do you actually attract those big brands back into the sport?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that, with respect to mountain biking, everyone's probably trying to figure out still. Mountain biking, I'll say the individual contracts and the team budgets are, I would say, really great, right? What we're missing across the board, right? And I think about when Trek was sponsored by Volkswagen, Cannondale was sponsored by Volvo, Gary Fisher was sponsored by Saab. For whatever reason, I don't, whether it's cars or airlines or some sort of other non-endemic, there hasn't been a team that has put forward in the space of mountain biking again a true non-endemic that really added a lot of horsepower, right? Um, so I think the mountain bikers are making most of the good ones are making a great living, but there hasn't been that categorical leap up. I think potentially LA has the chance to do that, but we'll see. And then what's happening on the road side, what's interesting to me is that these teams that are sponsored by nations, right? You have UAE. Up until recently, you had Astana, which was sponsored by Kazakhstan, Bahrain, for instance. These nation teams, effectively had no budget. Then there's, like, I would call it like the good old fashioned cycling teams, like an FDJ, which is hardcore French team. You've got a decathlon AG2R, again, like a standard French team, Alpecin, Soudal. Those teams are just doing it on straight sponsorship versus like a full blown, benefactor that's sponsoring the team. It seems that I'm predicting that we've reached a breaking point in probably where the pro cycling team budgets go. And I don't want to get like too nuanced and bore everybody here, but like I think this Tom Pidcock transfer to Q36.5 to me was the biggest signal that like we've maybe reached the top. And I think people will say, oh, Ineos has now freed up this like 3, 4, 5 million euro that we believe that Tom was on. And I think the owner, Jim Ratcliffe, of Ineos is just going to put that money back in his pocket and slowly start winding down the team, right? Mm. And you've got other teams in the men's world tour who I've spoken to, that would call me around and say, look, I need just under $1 million to change my life, because what they're trying to do is fund their bank guarantee for the budget that they've gone up, right? I just feel like every team now has a handful of superstars that are going to get paid this insane, like 3, 4, 5 million euro. And then the rest, I mean, certainly in the case of Q36.5 on Tom Pidcock's team, the majority of that team's getting paid the minimum salary, which is roughly $65,000.
Wow. Say more about the Tom deal, because I think there's some really interesting detail about that. He has a different sponsor for road and mountain bike. Is that right?
Sure. Yep. So Tom Pidcock's road team is sponsored by Scott Bicycles. I had read that the Scott bike deal comes up at the end of 25, but the owner of the road cycling team, Ivan Glassenberg, is a majority stakeholder in Pinarello. So he was running the Q36.5 team, and then Pinarello had been up for sale. He bought a large stake of that. And so then he's just going to slide, when they were doing this Tom deal, they would have said, okay, perfect. You're going to pay for his salary at Q36.5. That's obviously he's getting more money. And we're just going to take that same amount and we're going to cover that. You're going to race you're going to race cross and mountain bike on Pinarello, which I own anyway. And Scott ultimately said, like, look, we don't have money to pay for Tom Pidcock on the mountain bike to come and go as he pleases. So we're hands off on that deal. We're all good. So I think that that's just some of the nuance to it. Hats off to I know Tom's agent, Andrew McQuaid, I would say fairly well. He's a creative thinker. Uh, they would have worked that deal out, and they would have, it would have made sense for all parties.
An athlete with two different bike sponsors, essentially.
Yeah, it won't be that way in 26. It
No.
won't. It won't be that way in 26. I'm actually I'm a little bit surprised that like they didn't potentially just try and jettison the. It's so late in the year is the problem. The bikes are already like designated, but I'm surprised that Ivan Glassenberg, the owner of that team, didn't try to jettison the Scott Bikes deal and say, hey, look, like you can take the bikes back. We're just going to do Pinarello for our team as well. But
Interesting.
it was pretty late in the year to do that.
Do you think all the sort of machinations of the cycling industry as a result, kind of post pandemic, are going to have? I mean, are we going to see an outsized impact on sponsorship, or do you think it's mostly going to be sort of like not business as usual, but how much of an impact do you think it's going to be?
No, it's business as usual for the top teams. So the people that will really struggle. So I would argue that tier one athletes, it doesn't matter what sport you're in, triathlon, gravel, mountain bike, road bike, the tier one athletes, the people that brands need, they'll get paid more. Their salaries will keep going up.
Hmm.
What's going to happen is if you're a Division two men's team, which I used to sell for, your life's impossible. Again, if you're not winning gravel races in the U.S., really, really tough to make a living. So I think there will be it's not even a concentration. It's just, if you're good, you're going to get taken care of. But if you're below that marker, it's going to be really tough.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about gravel because that's been an interesting last couple years to, this thing kind of came out of nowhere. Now
Yeah.
road cyclists are jumping in and trying to compete, and a lot of people are, switching from the UCI. I sort of wonder, with all these changes to the UCI, will we see more people competing in gravel and the lifetime circuit and stuff like that?
Yep.
You had a post on LinkedIn recently. You said that you loved the format, but you believe the sport is dying.
Yep.
Tell me more.
Sure. So when the gravel bubble was blowing up, right? I mean, I was getting calls from brands, and they're like, "Pat, do you have anybody that will do gravel?" And I'm like, "No, I don't have anybody that will do gravel. Sorry." They were like, "Okay, well, we need to put gravel. We need a gravel cyclist." And brands were throwing, I mean, $50,000-$60,000 bike deals at athletes that, with all due respect, I'd never heard of, right? And I'm like, this is insane. But they needed the brands needed representation in that sport. They needed to say, we got somebody doing gravel, right? You talked about your surface area. I always call it celebrity squares. Like, the brands just needed somebody to fill every single box for them. What's going on? I would say, what I love about gravel, I'm doing a bunch of gravel races this year, is that it's approachable, right? It's here in the US. You can do it's just like a major marathon. But what I struggle to see past is now the UCI sunk their teeth into it. They're trying to make this UCI gravel series, which I still don't really have a comprehension for. But what I do have a comprehension for, and I think works for them, is the Gravel World Championships. That seems to be going really well. However, we'll use the US as a market here. There's nobody from the current crop of riders, in my opinion, with all due respect, that can win UCI Gravel Worlds, podium or even top 10, really. Keegan on the right course could, but that's it. So now if you're a brand and you were originally paying an athlete $100,000 to do gravel, but you have all these world tour athletes, like what we saw this year in the case of the women's race specifically. You have Lottie Kopecky that says, I want to do gravel. I like gravel worlds. Well, Specialized didn't pay her anymore to do gravel worlds. They just sent her a bike, a couple sets of wheels, and a mechanic. And the agent probably said, hey, if Lottie wins, can you just would you do a $25,000 bonus? And they go, sure. So now the brand is saying, why do I need to pay Susie or Doug to go and do all of these gravel races throughout the year, when I know that my world tour guys or gals are going to come over for the one race that I really care about, and it only costs me a bike? And that's the problem. So the brands are still gonna say, "Yep, I need some U.S. representation," but I'm gonna be a lot, I'll just say like a lot more, like a lot softer in my placement of my money there, and
Mm.
I can just get a handful of people that I know are gonna do 15, 20 events a year. They're gonna post on social media, and I'm gonna send them 3 or 4 bikes, and it's an easy bake oven. I'm gonna set it and forget it, not worry
Yeah.
about it. And then they're going to go, okay, well, now I'm just going to focus on who can I go and poach from the World Tour teams that I'm looking after that I think can win gravel worlds every year.
Just borrow them for a weekend.
Exactly. No, and it's cool. Like Lottie Kopecky loves being gravel world champion. That's a no brainer for Mariana Voss. Loves being. She will want to do that. She'll want to have that win. It will be something that they chase and aspire to.
Yeah, it seems
So
from from a competitive standpoint, that's where they're seeding all the athletes from. Domestically as an event to put on, it seems like a great thing and a great healthy.
it totally is. And look, I tried to register for Unbound this year. It's full. I was like, I put a $325 deposit down. I'm like, no way, they're not taking my money for that. Couldn't get in.
Unreal.
So there, from a participation standpoint, super super healthy, and I think it's going to keep getting bigger and better. But that hasn't brought, I would say, the super high performance yet on the world stage in that arena.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are, I want to keep those things two separate things. Gravel is not dead, but gravel, I would call it elite gravel racing in the U.S. is dying.
Interesting. Do you think there's anything to bring it back, or do you think the athletes that want to do it should
Uh,
just get onto the road program and
I don't know. I would want to roundtable that with some other people that have an opinion on it to kind of bounce some stuff back and forth. I'm not prepared or committed to make a statement on what I think should happen. I think USA Cycling is doing some awesome stuff by doing some junior recruitment from a gravel series that they've made. However, all that is that's just a development and talent ID pipeline for the road. Cyclocross is just in the U.S. is just a talent ID pipeline for the road. We could talk about, there's whispers that in March of 25, the IOC is going to give guidance on if cyclocross will be in the 2030 Olympics
oh wow,
for the Winter Games, which are going to be in Salt Lake City. Could completely, for a sport that's on life support, that could just completely inject new life into it. Could change the trajectory of that sport.
that's actually really cool. It's amazing how the Olympics can have sort of an outsized effect on a sport like that.
Yep.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard that. Are there any other trends that you're kind of paying attention to or thinking about that you're expecting to see in this next year?
Look, I think the bike industry demonstrated during COVID that they are terrible at forecasting. I think that they're going to continue to demonstrate that they're terrible at forecasting. So to say that they know what's going to happen in 25, I don't think that they have any idea. I think that they have ideas of what they think they're going to do, but again, they're just ideas. So look, I don't have any advice or insight on how you bring back or build back road racing in North America. I have no idea on what's going to happen with like these gravel races that are going on. So that's really hard for me to do, but it sure seems that when you're out riding your bike and you're at these events, you're with a ton of people that are also all really passionate about riding their bike.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I'm probably the most excited about is I've been going to all of these different events. I moved to a new state with my wife and kids 3 years ago, and so I got to see another part of the country. And I'm really optimistic for, I'll call it like cycling in the future. But yeah, how we're going to get from A to B, I don't have a great answer for you.
One of the things that you talked about, kind of community and people getting it together to ride. And I think one of the things that sort of got me off the bench when it came to making content in general was watching a gamer actually develop a community and what was interesting to me that really shook me to the core was he had this day where he did a fundraiser and he raised just an obscene amount of money for Wings for Life, which is Red Bull's charity of choice, right? And it was with the engagement of this like really really big community, and it made me realize that if you are capable at harnessing a large community of people together with a shared interest, there's a lot that can be done there. And thinking about gravel, thinking about road racing, I think there's a big opportunity there for someone to really kind of take that and run with it, tell that story, pull the community together, get people engaged. And it's in that case, not necessarily about the results, it's about the stories and stuff like that. That's obviously a big chunk of kind of where I'm going with my stuff too. But I think, yeah, it's a different lane that isn't reliant on, the competitive nature of things. Any thoughts from a athlete content creator topic?
Look, I think you can look at what the Lifetime series is doing, right? And I think that again, they've created something and they're using the athletes essentially as their cheapest and most effective marketing tool, right? They are telling stories, they are getting people that want to do their events, and the events are really hard to get into. And so I think from that standpoint, it's being done with the Lifetime series. I'd love to see, even if it's possible for that series to expand I think it could fit one or two more races in the right scenario. But that's obviously something that very interesting for me to observe. I would say how it's doing all of those things. One from the community, two from the eyeballs, and three from just like overall awareness. It's just, I mean, it makes me want to do Leadville, right? Like I tried to qualify for Leadville, I can't get into it. So yeah, I think it's working for sure.
We haven't really talked about this at all, but the T100 series, this is a triathlete series that is getting tons of investment sort of from outside the sport. Probably one of the few things that's actually being funded in a meaningful way, from outside of the sport, as opposed to some of these cycling teams and athletes that are getting endemic sponsorship. Can you talk about T100 and sort of what you've observed there in the last year?
Sure. So the genesis of the T100 started roughly 5 years ago. And it started as, ultimately a professional triathlete organization. And the T100 has turned in now to its own series. It's separate. So what we have now in the sport, we have two separate entities. We've got Ironman branded events and T100 branded events. And what this has done look, it's made life better for all of the athletes because there's been a huge infusion of cash into the sport. So T100 comes in with roughly $7 million a year in prize money and start fees. And, ultimately Ironman chose to effectively match it, right? I think with roughly $5.5 million in their pro prize pool. So if you're an athlete right now, if you're if you're a top 20 ranked professional athlete, triathlete rather, life is really good right now, better than it's ever been. The T100 is not an events organization like at heart, like Ironman is. So Ironman this past weekend at the 70.3 World Championships had 6,200 competitors,
Wow.
roughly 100 professionals. So they've got what I would call age group or amateur athletes effectively funding their business model, right? They're an events team. T100 on the other side is a broadcast product, much like I talked about with the mountain bike, the World Cup mountain bike side. So they're coming at it from an approach where they can sell and create a broadcast product similar to UFC, similar to tennis, similar to, I don't like to use the example, but F1, right? So it's I'll call it a lifetime opportunity for the sport of triathlon because they're I would say like the person that originally has been given all the money to the sport, Michael Moritz. You can go look him up. Incredibly wealthy individual that sees a future in the broadcast product here for triathlon. So the T100 product is you've got 20 of the best men, 20 of the best women, and they race each other roughly 5 or 6 times a year all around the globe. So I think I want to think of a world where the T100 exists in 15 or 20 years, and they really are trying to create a product and a service for the athletes that's above and beyond what exists elsewhere in the marketplace. So it's it's a very interesting time to be an athlete agent and navigate, I would say, the growing tension between these two organizations, because it's very palpable.
I can believe it. I mean, the T100 thing's really interesting because the thing that unlocks those giant salaries in the NFL and the NBA is the broadcast deal. Like that is how it's done. You know, the NFL, what is that deal worth? Like $5 billion or something hilarious that then gets, handed off to the athletes in a lot of cases. And so if the T100 can crack that code, they'd be one of the first endurance sports to figure it out. But if they can do it, then could ultra running do it? Could mountain biking do it? I mean, mountain biking has the Warner Brothers deal, but it's not the same, I think, at this
Yeah,
point.
it's funny. So Warner Brothers is an investor in the T100, and effectively what Warner Brothers has done has given their broadcast as VIK for the series to have as a platform to sell against, right? And so I'd say it's very similar to what they're doing in mountain biking, where they're trying to present and create a product they can ultimately sell advertising against.
Yeah.
And so I think an aligned incentive that Warner Brothers is an investor in the T100 series, because they get to ultimately create a product that their salespeople can go and try and sell.
I mean, I'm excited just to see how this stuff plays out. I feel like I've been in sports marketing for a decade or two, and every year it's something different. It's something new. You get to see, sort of these micro trends and macro trends coming through. And next year is going to be no exception. There's going to be a lot of different things that come in and come out of the sports. But this is super fun to like just riff on this stuff. I feel like this conversation was exactly how I intended it to be, sort of like fly on the wall of just like two dudes talking about their,
How the hell they're going to make decisions moving forward.
yeah, yeah, honestly. And how do you demonstrate value? How do you get people excited, and how do you present that in a meaningful way that the brands are going to be fired up about?
No, and it's funny. I had a call this morning where I got a competing offer for one of my clients, right? And I had called somebody else that I knew that was on the brand side that I could rely on. And I said, look, I need some help writing this text message, because I need to come off I want to come off very clear, but I don't want to be perceived as a dick, right? And I said, so like, help me write something that you would be okay with receiving, right? Because, yeah, a lot of times like it, and then, it's funny, like I sent the message off and the person at the brand just called me and said, look, let's chat this through. Like, what are you thinking? And so it's great to have somebody like you as a resource for me that's been on the brand side, said like, look, like help me not be an asshole here. Like how would I navigate this? Because it's so critical for the relationship piece.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. And yeah, it's challenging. It's like it's this standoff every single time. And if you don't have a relationship with the person at the brand or someone else at the brand that can give you context to those decisions, it a lot of times feels like you're kind of just like fumbling around in the dark trying to figure out like, do they want this or do they want this? Because I've been in a lot of situations where I think there's something really valuable in a discussion, and the person on the other side is like, nah, or vice versa, and that's a difficult way to be because everybody's doing great stuff. Brands are excited. Athletes are doing, incredible things. But putting them together is not as easy or obvious as a lot of people would think. It's not as simple as like, you're good. Come on over here and use our stuff.
And can you provide like probably a little bit more on the brand side of, a lot of times I get asked when I open with a number, they're like, start at 100 because they're going to counter at 50 and then we end up at 75. And my take is always like, I'm asking for what my client would be happy with, or what's already been demonstrated as a value through competing offer, right?
Yeah.
And so like on the brand side, like it's not your job either to just naturally like kick everything down. Like you have to justify that spend as well. But could you maybe give a little bit of context to me, like on what the other side is thinking about in the case of that, opening number, opening proposal?
A lot of times, and at Red Bull it was sort of easier because you had like when you buy a house and you go around to find all the comps in the neighborhood to say like, okay, this house sold for 1.5 million, this house sold for whatever. So you at least have like a fair idea of what you're paying the other athletes in the sport. And then you figure out, okay, well, where does this person fit in against that? And then what does their program actually look like? Is it apples to apples? We're just paying them to race the UCI World Series. Are they a junior or are they elite? Are they expected to be podium or not? A lot of times what we were doing was we would balance out the bonus structure and the salary to be kind of 50-50, and then there'd be a performance support, which was like
Yeah.
project fees or travel or whatever. And the thing that's interesting is that from a brand perspective, if you have a bonus in there, say for example, you mentioned earlier $250,000 bonus, that money goes into a bucket and stays there for the entire year, which could cause actually a big problem for me if your athlete doesn't hit that. It's not just like free money that's floating and I grab it in case they win a world championship. That's $250,000 that I have to park for a year and hope for the best. And in fact, there's a fun story at Red Bull where an athlete missed an Olympic incentive, and we hosted an entire summer camp where we flew in every single athlete. We did an athlete summit based on using just that one thing because they had missed their thing for the Winter Olympics.
But
And we had to,
but you had to spend it. Yeah.
yeah. So you can get it freed up if they miss their target. But, in the case where somebody's going to have a December event and they've got money tied up in a bonus, that brand is now scrambling to either lose that money or find a new home for it before the year ends, which is equally challenging. So the bonus thing is kind of tricky to navigate because that's basically like,
you have to account for it either way. You have to
yeah,
account for it if it happens or if it doesn't happen.
yeah, yeah. And it's almost worse if it doesn't happen because, you don't get the result and you don't know what to do with the money, or you have to find something to do. So Q4 at Red Bull was always a really interesting time. But
I got to experience some of the joys of fun Q4s at Red Bull via my wife. So
yeah, I got to do some really cool projects in Q4, but you never know how it's going to go. But that was always an interesting and tricky thing to balance out. And I think like when it comes to it, there was never an immediate idea that we were going to kick it down. We'd always just try to keep it within range of what the other athletes were earning.
Yep.
And if it was going to be a number that was 2, 3, 4x what the other athletes were getting, there better be a really good reason why. What I really struggle with a lot was sort of betting on future performance when it comes to these deals. And what I never wanted to do with athletes, and unfortunately did do a few times, I let them become the tall blade of grass when it came to signing a big deal. And you had an athlete who was making 2 to 3x what the other athletes in that sport were making. And then when it came time to have those budget discussions, you had to really justify what they were doing. And if they weren't competing or they weren't delivering much, they were in a really bad place. Whereas if I had just kept them in a reasonable range, they probably would have been able to hang on for another contract or two.
Yeah.
So it's really tricky kind of balancing out. Like I want to pay these athletes what they're worth. I want to incentivize them, but I don't want to go too big because then, gosh, I don't want to have to cut them in the next contract cycle.
Yeah, it was funny too. I was talking to one of your, wasn't a predecessor, but it was a marketing manager from a different region, right? And it's you always negotiating at Red Bull would have been really interesting because every athlete wants to be there, right? So you do have, and then there's not really a competitor in the space, right? So it's not like you've got an athlete that's available to track Specialized Canyon, Cannondale simultaneously.
Right.
It's like you would have always been quite confident, like they're just communicating with you in that category or that space. And it's like, well, if you're talking to Power Bar, like I'm 50 times cooler than Power Bar, so I don't really give a shit what they offered, right? Like you just naturally had so much leverage in that position, so you had to almost be careful that you weren't wielding it too much or too firmly because you could just naturally kill a lot of deals through right of trying to get this athlete at a steal price, right?
Yeah, I think, we talked about bringing value as well. I think Red Bull, yeah, of course, it's like there's something meaningful about getting a Red Bull helmet, but also the performance side of things where athlete super invests in the athlete performance. And I was kind of joked about it. It's almost like insider trading. Like you can find an athlete that has promise, but hasn't like popped yet. and then you give them all these resources to turn them into like a super world champion within a short period of time, and give them all the assistance that they could possibly ever need to get to that point. And then all of a sudden they're world champ, and now you look like a genius
Yeah.
because you gave them the resources to help them get to that point. And then, of course, I can't take any credit for that, but it certainly is something that the athletes are looking for as well. Can I get real support? And I think that was a big reason why I was at Red Bull. I always wanted to be that extra 1% that was going to help an athlete get to that point. It wasn't about Red Bull's marketing initiatives or their KPIs or goals. It was really about, how do I work with an athlete to give them something meaningful over time? And I think a lot of brands kind of miss out on that part of it.
Changing subjects a little bit, but it's in line with this. But it's something I'm always curious about is, one thing I always look at or try and search for in my business is negotiation training or tactics, right? And was that something that you ever? Where do you feel you landed as an absolute negotiator?
Oh man, that's interesting to like rate myself as a negotiator. I definitely read Chris Ray's book while I was at Red Bull. The what's the name of this book?
No. Chris Voss, Never Split
Chris
the Difference.
Voss. There it is.
Never split the difference.
Yep, Chris Voss. Yeah, different Chris.
My favorite line from that book is, and I use it all the time, is all deadlines are bullshit. And I'm like,
reality is negotiable, right? Like you said, there's no rules in any of this stuff. I mean, I think like what's interesting, as a negotiator, I think I was good because I was fair and I had a reasonable budget to work with at all times. So I wasn't necessarily nickel and diming anybody.
Yep.
But I also think that Red Bull sort of kind of stayed away from the like super pro agents, and we actually got kind of the ick factor if you were like too pro, because you were, playing hardball with us, and we just didn't. That's not why we do partnerships. We're not doing it as like a business deal. We're doing it as a collaboration.
Yep.
And if you come through super gnarly, then we're like, you know what? Actually, like, so much of the value we bring to your athlete is the sort of spur of the moment, like, hey, you know what else we could do? We could do this thing that's going to be game changing for you and your career. And the athlete's like, yeah, let's do that. And a lot of these super pro agents are like, okay, so you can have 2 days with this person. You can't talk to them. You have to do this, this, and this, and you owe us this if you do that. And that was just like, that's not us. That's not how we partner. And so actually, like, you didn't need to have the highest level of negotiation and like whatever skills, because that was never really the ethos of the partnership to begin with.
It's similar to how I think about it, where I think like, people talk about like the contract, and I'm like, look, you have to think of these things as a true partnership. And the contract, yes, we got to have that buttoned up, dialed up. But I'm like, that's ultimately like a guiding light or a principle. Like if I got to look at a contract to see the minutia that's in here to know if this deal is going to work, like we're 8 months into it, I'm like, then we've already lost.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel like contracts are there in case things go wrong, in my mind. Like, I want to over deliver on everything that's in the contract from my side, and I want the athlete to do the same.
Yep. But I think it's a back and forth, right? And you got to be able to sit there and go, okay, well, what was the intent of what was written here? What were we really trying to achieve or protect?
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately like when you're redlining the contract, you're saying, well, what is this brand ultimately, like, who burned, like, why do they have this term in here? Where did they get burned on? Right. Like, and it'd be something around, you can't sell bikes on eBay. And you're like, okay, well, what donkey was selling all their bikes on eBay and got, some in trouble? And you go, okay, so that's that person's rule. And then you go, okay, well, why is this rule in there? And you go, the brand will tell you, wow, we had this problem with such and such, and we got to have that in there. Okay, well, thanks, that makes sense now. So I just think so much of it's a true partnership. And then I think, going back to the negotiation side, I've talked to my attorneys about negotiating. I've read these read the books, but I haven't taken like any formal, like, sit down with somebody and try and negotiate something. And I think, but you have these moments in my career where, I can certainly tell, am I winning this negotiation or am I losing this negotiation? Right. And it's like, I always feel that, but it's not like you said, it's not like you come in just swinging and say, look, this is what's available. This is it's a conversation, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
got to
because
keep.
ultimately, if you're going to get a renewed contract at the end of that contract, it better feel like you both got something. Because
Yeah,
if it's one-sided from the beginning, it's not going to happen
it ain't
again.
gonna work. Yeah,
Yeah,
of course. Yeah, and
and
the other thing that you have to remember too is I'm representing the how my future clients will look, right? So what I can't ever do is get pissed off at you working at Red Bull and tell you to go, somewhere not fun. And then I get, little Johnny 3 years later who really wants to be sponsored by Red Bull. And I can't tell Johnny, man, I really pissed off that marketing manager 3 years ago. I'm sorry, they'll never work for me. They'll never work with you because
right.
of me.
Yeah.
So my number one duty is to protect those relationships at all costs for all of my clients, right?
Man, what a fun discussion. I feel like we could go for another whole
Yeah,
hour.
yeah, yeah.
I want to wrap it up with this final segment we always do. It's called brand product content, which is sort of like stuff that we're excited about. I've got something that I'm going to talk about that I made, and I'll tee it up for, since you're the guest, you go first. And there's something that you and I haven't talked about yet that I think is relevant to this audience, but I'll leave it open to you.
Um, Look, well, so I'm going to pick one, a brand, product, or content.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, the brand, the one that got away, it's Athletic Brewing. So they they had started, they had tried to do some brand deals with me in their infancy with some of my clients, and the reality is they weren't cool enough for any of my clients. And if you followed Athletic Brewing's story, they've blown up, and now they're too cool for all of my clients. And so I'm an avid user. I've tried, man, I've tried. They wanted to sponsor one of my athletes really bad, but it wasn't a fit. That athlete didn't drink the product, and
Mm.
so that was a really tough one. But man, yeah, that's one that I would. Gosh, I wish I could unlock more. Just yeah, because I think I'm such a fan of it. But that's a personal one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how like athletes have dream brands, but then you have dream brands that you want to start working with and
Totally, totally. Yeah. It's
that's
like,
awesome.
yep.
Okay, but also on the content side, we usually just do one, but I want you to talk about this podcast that you're also
Oh,
doing too.
sure, 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 sure. So much like everybody else during COVID, I started a podcast with two people, two of my buddies, Talbot and Kyle. It was like we were talking about all the triathlons that were happening. We had this big text chain, and it was like, okay, well, we should just start talking about this on a podcast.
Yeah.
So we did. We always joked it was like, okay, we got three listeners: Kyle's mom, Kyle's dad, and my dad. So um, it slowly we added another host, and then I remember when we got our first 1,000 download episode. I remember when it was like 4,000. I remember 10,000, 20,000, and now we are getting on average 35,000 downloads a week per
Amazing.
episode. Just talking about it's called Pro Tri News. It's on Apple, Spotify, etc. But we are incredibly nuanced just talking about pro triathlon. So if you're thinking you're going to go on there and learn how to do a triathlon, that's not the podcast for you. But we go insanely deep on everything that's happening in the pro sport side of it. So
Cool.
it's this weird conflict of interest that I'm in, where now I'm selling against it. I call the podcast one of my clients, and it's this weird place that I'm in. But it's been an amazing tool to probably help give some insight and shed some light on what's actually happening in the sport
Yeah.
of professional triathlon. So yeah, all facets of it we're covering. It's my baby. It's my passion project. I spend way too much time on it. But yeah, if you're bored and you want to hear about it, it's Pro Tri News.
Very cool. That's actually how Second Nature started as well. Dylan and I were always texting each other and calling, talking about like, "Do you see this? Did you see this?" And one day he was like, "We should probably just record this and share it. I feel like more than just the two of us would find this interesting and helpful and insightful, and it'd just be a good excuse to talk to each other every week." And that was sort of the genesis of Second Nature as well. It's funny how those like little side conversations end up taking on a life of their own, you know?
Yeah, I'm sorry. You used the word Genesis, and I used that on a call this morning with some non-native English speakers, and they said, "Sorry, can you explain Genesis?" And so I'm like, "I'm really sorry about that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Then I explained it. So I'm happy that you use that word also, because I felt really bad about that today.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to bring it home. My BPC for this week is a project that actually launched on the Super Rider channel. And I think this is relevant to our discussion because the project at launch was in partnership with the San Francisco Peninsula Tourism Board. And John, who is one of my good friends that actually listens to the podcast, and we're going to have him on pretty soon to kind of deep dive into it. We went there for Super Rider. We rode the area, and I basically gave like a sort of like Bourdain on bikes. You know, it's like, here's where you ride, but here's where you get coffee before the ride. Here's where you get burritos after the ride. This is the area. You know, did you know that within 20 minutes of San Francisco's airport, it's like all this awesome protected land where you can ride bikes and have this amazing weekend? And sort of where I'm thinking about going with this whole project is actually reaching out to more tourism boards and getting a chance to like build a production team and build a series based off of this idea of there is a ton of value in the world that is not related to the cycling industry. And if I can be a part of that, then I don't have to necessarily worry as much about what's happening in mountain biking. I can just be guy on the camera showing people around the world of all these amazing places and working with these regional teams to make it happen.
I grew up in Minnesota. I'm from North Dakota, but I grew up in, spent a ton of time in Minnesota. And I would say the renaissance of mountain biking in that state from a level of people that are just participating in the sport. They're not racing, but they're just riding.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've taken these communities that were completely dormant and dead when I was a kid, and they've been revitalized, and they've been made like very cool places to be and live and hang out. And so yeah, I think it's completely untapped, you know, from a tourism side. And tourism boards have figured out that cycling does bring a ton of extracurricular spending along with it. And so, yeah, I think it's completely untapped for you. And yeah, could be really awesome.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Well, Pat, thanks so much for the. I mean, we could do this. We could be talking for another whole hour and still have plenty left to do, which we're gonna have to have a part two at some point. But
Yeah,
thanks so much for the time today. This is
sure,
awesome.
man. Thank you.